Anyway, I am the one who goes before and prepares the way for the one who will answer all your questions about the book of Judges. And my task is to give a general overview and an introduction. And that's
Bart, I won't be taking questions.
Oh my goodness. Yes, it is. You can turn the other mic. I think you want the PA up? Okay. You got to put the PA up some. Judges is a dark book. How many of you have read Judges? Okay, that's actually better than I would expect. It's not a book that's often read. It's often called the story of Israel's dark ages, and it illustrates the depravity to which the nation sank between Joshua and the kings. And in doing so, it not only tells us about Israel, but it repeats a theme that is all through the Bible that talks to us about, in one word, I would use the word entropy. Now, entropy is a scientific term for the fact that everything decays, right? You put your Chevrolet in a field and leave it for 20 years, it will not turn into a Cadillac. It will turn into a rusty old Chevrolet, right? Yeah, right. It does not evolve into a better car, let alone a train. Entropy is also true in the sense of nations who tend to disintegrate. Now, does that strike a familiar tone to you? Probably does, yeah. Especially in the light of what we've seen lately. So this is going to be the story of Israel's descent, the steady process of their descent from a position of glory and victory under Moses and Joshua to defeat and the loss of glory and depravity under Eli, who begins in 1 Samuel. It goes in cycles of apostasy, oppression, deliverance. And when we think of Judges, very often what we think of is Gideon. You know, he went out with his pitcher and his sword and the 300 men, and they destroyed the Midianites. What a glorious victory. Well, yeah, that was, but that's not the point of Judges. The Judges isn't about glorious victory. Judges is about the fact that God intervenes to protect his people, even when they don't deserve it. And when they cry out in pain. And war is a constant theme. This is a very bloody book. And everywhere you go, there's a war of oppression. There's a war of deliverance. There's even civil wars between the tribes and wars within a tribe. And an awful lot of gruesome things take place. And at the very end, the book tells us about the situation in the nation that is so bad that one pastor writes in his study that he gave the portion of scripture to one of his parishioners or one of the congregation to read, like we have Jack read for us. And he says, I can't read this. So this is not a happy, clappy kind of a study. We have much to be joyful about, but Judges is a very stern warning. And it's a theme that we're going to go through. And you'll see it's a theme that occurs over and over. We always start, of course, with our chart of world history. We do that because this is what God has revealed to us about his plan for his creation from the time of creation to the time it is totally destroyed. There is a point at which it will be destroyed. Jack, can you read for us 2 Peter 3:10-13?
But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming. That day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. But in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness.
In the beginning, Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth. We get this idea somehow that God lives in heaven. God doesn't dwell in heaven. heaven and earth dwell in the mind of God. That's a different way of looking at it. And he created the heavens and he created the earth. He created the angels and all their inhabitants at the beginning, and he will destroy the heavens and the earth at the end. That's why John Bunyan, in his famous book, A Pilgrim's Progress, starts out with Christian living in a place called the City of Destruction. And he is burdened with this terrible burden that he carries. And he knows that it is coming a day when it will be destroyed. And he says, how can I escape this? And of course, this would be a scary charge, because humankind is running from catastrophe to catastrophe. The next one in front of us is not very pretty. And then behind that, there's the destruction of the heavens and the earth and this great judgment where God is going to bring it all to right. And there'd be no comfort to us except for this. That cross is at the center of God's plan for history. And I show this every time for a reason. I was in college at Wheaton College, and I remember virtually nothing about my classes except one thing. I had to take an Old Testament class, and I don't know the name of the prof. I could barely see him. I know he had white hair. He was a little portly. But that's all I remember. I don't even remember what he taught. But I remember every day he came into class, he'd come in with his weathered Bible under his arm. He didn't have any other notes. He just used his Bible as all dog-eared. And he would walk in. And remember, in those days, the blackboard was from one side of the room to the other. Okay. And he would come in, and he would pick up a piece of chalk, and he would just go like this all the way across the room. And then he would come back, and he would go like this, like that. Every time. That had a powerful effect on me. And I want that to have that same effect on you. History is not evolving over millions and millions of years. It isn't going to go on to forever and ever and ever. Man is not the center of this. God has a purpose and a plan. It is limited in duration. It has a beginning. It has an end. And the cross is your sign of hope. It's your only hope. So we look at this. This gives us an idea of where we are. We're going to look here at the second millennium BC. That would be the second 1,000 years, from 1,000 BC before Christ to 2,000. Abraham, Moses, David. We're going to look between Moses and David. So let's drill down a little bit. Okay. And so here's where we are. Moses and David. This shows you what we know about the chronology. And I always want to start with where we are in time. The blue square here, this rectangle, is the period we're going to be studying, the period of the Judges. Now, we have a pretty firm date in the Bible for the Exodus, and it's tied to the date that Solomon dedicated the temple, which we understand pretty much from secular as well as biblical sources was about 966 BC. And then it says in 1 Kings 6:1 that in the day, in the day 480 years from the time that they left Egypt to the dedicating of the temple was 480 years. So we back up from 966, that gives us 1446. Then we know there's 40 years of wandering in the wilderness after a year at Sinai. So roughly here, 1406, Joshua crosses the Jordan and begins the conquest. But we don't know how long the conquest took. I'm guessing 10 years, maybe. Okay. We've been over that in our study of Joshua. We really don't know when Joshua died, because the period of the Judges begins when he dies. He dies at the age of 110. But we don't know how long after the conquest he lived. He probably acted as sort of a judge. He was certainly the leader of the nation. But somewhere around here he died. And then the period of the Judges ends when Saul is inaugurated as king by Samuel. And we don't know for sure exactly where that is. We know that David reigned for 40 years. Acts tells us that Saul reigned for 40 years. So that would put it right here. But there's some doubt about that. It could be as small as 20 years. So this is a period of about 300 to 350 years. The only point that we have in the book of Judges that might fix the time at all is when Jephthah is arguing with another king, and he says, hey, look, we've occupied those towns on the east side of the Jordan for 300 years. Well, we know that means 300 years from the time of the Exodus, from the time of the conquest beginning. So that puts Jephthah right here. So he's toward the end of the period of the Judges. Beyond that, we don't know a whole lot. Othniel, who is the first judge in the book, was the son-in-law and the nephew of Caleb. So he has to be pretty much back here at the beginning. Now, obviously, Caleb didn't live forever. So that's our timing, and that's the bracket. I just want you to remember 300 to 350, okay? Now the question goes in, what is a judge? There is a little bit of confusion. We think of a judge, black robe, sits behind the desk, he has the gavel, he takes your lawsuit and he takes your money and gives it to the guy or whatever. It's a dispute resolution mechanism applying the law. Well, that existed ever since Moses. Remember when Jethro came to the camp at Sinai and he said, you can't do this all by yourself, Moses, and he set up a judicial system. So that existed. But that's not who the judges were, although they were, some of them, judges in the other sense. So I'm going to use two different words. I'll use judges. I'm talking about judges in the sense of the deliverer of Israel in this book. And I'll also use jurist to mean a person who's a conventional judge. Maybe he rides the circuit or he holds court and he applies the law. Is that okay? So judges are the deliverers, and jurists are the traditional judges. Many times they were both, all right? So we'll get into that. So what were they? Sometimes they were judges, sometimes there were other things. It amazes me. I went to this book and started reading this. I'm saying, well, wait a minute, this is what I thought. This was a motley bunch. I mean, Gideon, he was a farmer, scared of the Midianites, hiding. Jephthah, he was a soldier, but he was an outlaw. He'd been thrown out of the light society. He was the son of a prostitute. He had gathered a band of outlaws to follow him, and he was roaming the plains of Gilead, raiding towns. Deborah was a prophet herself, but she was also a jurist as a traditional judge, and she was a woman. Othniel, he was a soldier. We know he fought with Caleb. Eli was a priest. And Samuel, he was a priest, a prophet, and a jurist. He did them all. He rode the circuit. So just how does this whole idea of a judge fit? And it tells us that pretty much in the very beginning of the book in chapter 2. And Jack, I'd like you to read 15 all the way through 18a, the beginning of 18. Okay?
Okay. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived.
Now, so first thing these people were deliverers. Now you notice it doesn't say they were soldiers who went to war. They were deliverers from hostile oppressors, but they weren't always soldiers. Most of the time, I think they were, and they went to war. In some cases, Deborah, who was not a soldier, went to war anyway. She sort of had to be a security blanket for her general Barak. But regardless of what you say, deliverance always involved war. There was always an oppression. The Philistines would oppress them. The Arameans would oppress them. Everybody was. What do I mean by oppression, by the way? All right, oppression means I have a city-state, and I want your city-state's money. And so I come and I raid your city, and I threaten to kill everybody, and I take everything you own, and then I say, I'll let you live, provided you pay me every year this sum of money. Okay? Which means those people became the slaves of the person who was oppressing them. They would have to work really hard to get that amount of money, and then maybe to get it just enough beyond that for them to subsist, and then they would take it to the oppressing king. And if they didn't meet the toll, that king would come and slaughter them all. That's what it means by oppression. So it was a really bad thing to be oppressed. And so it always involved war to turn the tables. And that's what they did. A good example would be Othniel, the very first one in chapter 3. He was Caleb's nephew and also his son-in-law. Back in Judges 15, he said, whoever can take this particular city can have my daughter Aksa. So he said, I'll do that. And he went there and he took that city, threw out the Canaanites, and got a wife. And so he appears in chapter 3, verses 9 to 11. Go ahead, Jack.
But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died.
By the way, congratulations on getting Cushan-Rishathaim. That was a tough one. Wow. Yeah, so he goes to war. God raises him up. He gives him a commission. He goes to war, delivers the people, and then there's peace for 40 years. Well, what did they do during that peace for 40 years? Well, they probably were also jurists. They would hold court. They had an influence on the public life of Israel. We see that among the others. Deborah was a jurist in that sense. She was in 4:4-5. Can you give us that one real quick?
Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided.
Okay, so Deborah was a judge in that sense, and it says she was leading Israel. By the way, that's the same word. So the Bible does not make a difference between judge in the sense of deliverer and judge in the sense of jurist. So they probably did both. But the judges that we care about are the ones who were deliverers as well. Deborah was one of those. She went to war with her timid general. Now, it seems that they had some kind of influence in addition to delivering them militarily, because it always says that for the duration of that person's life, who was the judge, then they had peace. And as soon as the judge died, they turned away from the Lord. So they must have had some influence to maintain that discipline. Some of them were priests and prophets. Deborah, we know, was a prophet. It says she was a prophet there in Bethel. In the last two judges are not in the book of Judges. They're in the book of 1 Samuel, and they are Eli and Samuel. Eli was a priest, and Samuel was the last judge, and he actually held court as a jurist, as a priest, and as a prophet. And he's the one who actually begins the schools of the prophets, the seminaries that produce the prophets that produce Jeremiah, Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, and so forth. 1 Samuel 7:15-17 describes Samuel.
Samuel continued as judge over Israel all the days of his life. From year to year, he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was, and there he also judged Israel. And he built an altar there to the Lord. So
Samuel was a judge, and he had a great influence in delivering Israel from Philistines in the great battle of Mizpah, especially after Eli was such a failure. And yet he's never recorded as leading in battle. Neither is Eli. So this judge idea is a little bit more complex than simply some warrior that comes and delivers them. But one thing they never were is they never were kings or proto-kings. God had intended that this was to be a theocracy. They had tribal governments, as they've had all the way back to the days of Egypt, and all the administrative functions were pretty well taken care of by the tribes. I mean, they kept the trains running on time. But the unity of the nation was only meant to be kept through the priests at Shiloh and the Levites who had cities all throughout Israel. And it was their devotion to the Lord that united them as a nation. Consequently, when they turned away from the Lord, what happened? They all split apart. And God was delivering them to keep them together. A good example of this was chapter 8, 22 and 23. Gideon, after his great victory, was asked to be their king. Jack, 22 and 23.
The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us out of the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you."
The Lord is your king. This was definitely a theocracy. He refused. And one of the interesting things about Gideon is he, by the time his 40 years of peace were up, he had over 70 sons. presumably he was a polygamist. But he had a lot of kids, okay? It's like the Oriental kings of old. They're trying to seed their administration with their offspring. But he said, I'm not going to be your king, and my sons are not going to be a king. And as soon as he died, one of his sons decides he wants to become the king. He says, I think that's a good idea. And he takes 70 of his brothers and he slaughters them. And that precipitates a civil war in which he is killed and the entire city of Shechem is killed. It's chapter 9. You can read about it. And John will tell you all you need to know about that. So this is a complex picture of who the judges were, but they all did have one single thing in common. And that is that they pointed the people back to Jehovah, to Yahweh, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because that was the most important thing. Chapter 2, verse 19 gives us an example of that.
But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways.
So you can see, as soon as they died, the people returned to worshiping the Baals, which is another way of saying they worshiped creation or created things and fertility and all that good stuff. While they were there, they were able to point the people back to Jehovah. The priests once again fulfilled their role, so did the Levites, and they remained God's people, at least nominally. Now, a couple other things besides being military deliverers, they were all divinely appointed. By the way, this chart is all the judges that are mentioned in the book of Judges, okay? And you can see it goes from Othniel all the way to Samson. In 1 Samuel, you have Eli and then Samuel, not necessarily all in that order. We don't know for sure how that worked out. But they had in common the fact that they were divinely appointed. In chapter 3, verse 9, it says, Jack, have you got that? 3:9?
Yes, we read that once. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them.
Okay, the next judge, it says, verse 15, again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man. Now, and his story is awesome, but I'm not going to steal that thunder. You'll have a good time with that one. When the people cried out, do you notice something that's missing here? Where's the leadership? Where's the leadership? It's not like the priests cried out. The priests sent evangelists throughout the country and said, we need to restore our worship. And there was only one time in the book of Judges where anything like that went on, and that was actually in 1 Samuel. That's where Samuel led kind of a revival. It was when the people themselves cried out. No help from the government, no help from the religious leaders. It was when the people hurt enough that they cried out. And I want you to keep that in mind. You know, even though they were sunk in idolatry, as they were, and all the horrible things that go along with that, they must have had some kind of a memory, a corporate cultural memory, that they came from the God who parted the Red Sea, who dropped the walls of Jericho, who conquered the promised land and promised that land to them. They had a memory in spite of all their depravity. And all I could think of was 9/11. What happened after 9/11? Where did everybody go? Church. They didn't go to the bar. They didn't go to the sports stadium. They went to church. We too have in the back of our minds, no matter how pagan we have become, there is in Americans a memory that we were founded on the biblical principles of God's word, and he is our God. And when we talk about God of our fathers, this is the God that we are talking about. Now, another thing about them, they did not always lead the military forces of everybody. I think I mentioned that before. Unlike Moses and Joshua, who led the entire nation of 12 tribes, sometimes they'd go to war and one or two tribes would say, not for us, we're going to abstain. And sometimes one tribe would go against the other. Sometimes there was internecine conflict in between them. And these judges got involved in all of that. Sometimes the judge was kind of independent. He didn't seem to belong to the country. A classic example of that is Samson. I mean, Samson was the ultimate loser hero. There's not one campaign, not one battle in which Samson engaged that wasn't a matter of his personal fight, usually over a woman. You know, he had a couple of wives. In both cases, that resulted in conflict with the Philistines. And eventually, Delilah got him to reveal the source of his strength. And then his eyes poked out and he was put into captivity. He's a real tragic man. And he'll be an interesting study for us as we go through the book. But they did not lead all of the armed forces. They were often independent of action. One thing, for example, seems to be true is that they overlapped. For example, now, I've always said, when you study the Bible, there are two things you have to have: a map and a calculator. That's right. So with your calculators, I want you to add up all these years, because they pretty well give you, they're not inclusive, they're exclusive pretty much. And I'll give you a lower estimate, probably well below, of the years that are talked about in the period of the Judges. And you should add another 30 or 40 for Samuel. And you get around 407 to 450 years. How many years were there according to the timeline? Only about 350. So obviously these guys were coterminous. They were contemporaries of one another. There's some indication that Ehud and Shamgar were together. Jephthah and Samson seemed to be operating at the same time. Jephthah was fighting to the east. He fought the Ammonites, and Samson was, to the extent he was fighting the Philistines to the west. And so they were kind of contemporary. And then the other thing you got to know about them is there were major players and there are minor players. Now, if you go based on the text that's devoted to them, you get a sense of who's big and who's small. Shamgar gets one verse. That's all that poor guy gets. We don't know too much about Shamgar. But Samson, the biggest loser of them all, gets 4 chapters. And you might wonder, why would God give 4 chapters to such an unusual and pathetic creature? And John is going to give you all the answers you need to know about that. So, Mario.
And yet he's in the Hall of Faith.
He's in the Hall of Faith. You're right. He is. And so you don't exactly know either everything that they did. You only know some of what they did and the things that God seemed important to have us ask. So the big ones that are in the book of Judges are the blue ones here: Deborah, Barak, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson, and of course Samuel in 1 Samuel. The last thing I want to tell you about Judges is they were not necessarily good men. Like I said before, Jephthah was the son of a prostitute and an outlaw. He had been cast out of polite society. He was out in the wilderness of Gilead, and it says that a whole passel of scoundrels attached themselves to him. And they were basically Robin Hood's merry men, and they went around raiding and stealing and doing. He was the judge that God chose and rose up. Gideon, of course, a farmer who was timid and afraid. And Gideon, even Gideon, who we think of as the great hero, at the end of his life, he set up an ephod that became an idol, and he caused Israel to sin. That's found in chapter 8, verse 27. Can you give us that real quick?
Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family.
Yeah, so these were all good men. Jephthah himself actually wound up making his own daughter a human sacrifice. That's terrible. And that was after the victory. Life was cheap. Warfare was brutal in the time of the Judges. Now, just the structure of the book, very briefly. Chapters 1 and 2 describes the last days of Joshua before he died, and some of the efforts after his death, particularly by the tribe of Judah, to complete the conquest. And then very quickly culminated in general apostasy. The people would rather get the tribute and the money and coexist. So, and then chapters 13 to 16 describe this cycle of disobedience, oppression, They cry out, God raises up the deliverer, Israel's delivered, Israel's at peace, Israel disobeys. I mean, you can apply that to your own life, right? We can apply that to a national life, to the life of a family. It's a pretty typical cycle that typifies that. The last two stories up here in chapter 17 through 21, 4 chapters, are horrific stories. It's a treatment of a woman who was a common wife or a concubine wife of a Levite who is supposedly God's messenger. And the things that are done to her are unspeakable. And the civil war that it produced was bloody. And what these last what these last 4 chapters explain to us is how really ugly and depraved the people had sunk. Even as you go through these periods with the judges, and they may not all be exactly consecutive or, exclusive, but as you go through this period, you see God's deliverance, they're falling away. God's deliverance, they're falling away. But each time, it seems to go a little bit lower, right? And you'll see the same theme in the life of Israel during the kings. We'll be doing the kings in a few months. And you'll see that God raises up at the end of Israel's history, he raises up Hezekiah, who brings a revival, and then they fall away under his son Ammon and Manasseh. And then God raises up Josiah, but things aren't quite the same and not quite as high. And then they go into captivity. There is a short-term cycle and there is a long-term descent into depravity. Now, what themes? I want to give you 4 themes that exist throughout the book of Judges, and what can we learn from them? The Apostle Paul says that these Old Testament stories are given to us as examples because we can learn from them. Well, what can we learn from them? How can we apply them to our own lives, personally, and to our own life nationally? Well, the very first is this whole idea of corruption. From victory and glory under Joshua to defeat and ignominy under Eli. And it proceeds in 3 stages, or there'd be 3 characteristics of it. The first one is partial victory. Chapter 1, 19 to 21. Jack?
The Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had iron chariots. As Moses had promised, Hebron was given to Caleb, who drove from it the 3 sons of Anak. The Benjamites, however, failed to dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites.
So the first thing is partial victory. They did not complete the job. They, in some cases, felt that they couldn't. They didn't have enough strength, enough courage, and don't know why, but they didn't complete the job. But the iron-rimmed chariots are characteristic of that period. They were living in a period where bronze tools could no longer be made because of the lack of tin. It's called the Great Bronze Contraction. And only iron could be made, but that was much technologically harder. You had to get a higher temperature. And so only a few people knew how to do that. Later on, when Saul and Jonathan go to war, the only blacksmith was the ones in the Philistine country. And so they were the only 2 guys that had swords. So there were some technical issues. There were issues of military might, but for whatever reason, they couldn't finish that job. But there were also other reasons. One of them was, it was a whole lot better to say, well, we'll let you live, providing you become our slaves and you send all that tribute to us. Remember what I said before about oppression? Rather than kill them or drive them out of the country, then they would keep them and they would get tribute from them. So that makes good sense, right? Partial victory. Second thing is, its form of corruption was coexistence with the enemy. Chapter 2, 1 and 2.
The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give your forefathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this?
Coexistence with the enemy was indicated, for example, in the story. A fellow by the name of Aber made an alliance with Jabin, who was a Canaanite king, and his general Sisera. Now, it would fall later on to Barak and Deborah to fight a war with this man. So here you have an Israelite in a treaty of friendship and cooperation with a Canaanite king whom they were expected to drive out of the country. Isn't that interesting? One of the things that doing this does is when you make an alliance with your enemy, you legitimize his right to exist. Remember, the Canaanites had no right to that land because the Lord of heaven and earth had said, clear them out. This land is for my people. You may like that or not like that, but that's what the Bible teaches. So they, by making these alliances, they sort of legitimize, yeah, it's okay for you to be here. You just have to work with us. Does that sound like an alliance that we've made recently? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. By making an alliance with Iran and the JCPOA, we are legitimizing their right to a nuclear weapon. By making an alliance with the Taliban, we are legitimizing their right to dominate the nation of Afghanistan. This is not a sign of glory or of victory. This is a sign of defeat coming fast and corruption. Thirdly, the union through marriage and religion, 3, 5, and 6.
The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods.
Marriage is the closest of all human relationships, the most intimate relationship that there is. And they began to intermarry with the Canaanites. And God does not want that to happen. Why? Well, remember, it is his purpose that through this particular nation, the whole world would be blessed by bringing in the word of God and bringing the Son of God. And it does not do for them to disappear among the nations by intermarrying. Not only that, intermarriage always affects religion. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Intermarriage always affects religion. And so as a result, they would be drawn off to other gods. Example, Moab and the Baals of Peor back in the days of Moses. It wasn't something new. And so the fact that they intermarried with the Canaanites meant that they served their gods. All right. So having said this about corruption being a major theme, what can we learn from it? Well, first of all, there's partial victory. Partial victory in your life and mine. What is partial victory? Well, over who? Over what?
Satan.
Over what?
Satan.
Satan. Well, okay. Anybody else? What are you at war with in your life?
The world, the flesh,
Oh, what did I just hear?
the world, the flesh, and the devil.
The world, the flesh, and the devil. Thank you. We'll do our catechism here very shortly. But the world. Now, what is the world? In 1 John 2, 15 to 17, what does it say? Jack?
Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever.
So you ask yourself, what is the world? And I would love to just sit down and have everybody give us input, but we're going to run out of time if we don't. So this is the best definition of it I've ever seen. It comes out of a very old version of the Bible called C.I. Scofield, the New Scofield Reference, which was a big deal when we were kids. And one of his notes says, in the present sense, in the sense of the present world system, the ethically bad sense of the world refers to the order or arrangement under which Satan has organized the world of unbelieving mankind upon his cosmic principles of force, greed, selfishness, ambition, and pleasure. This world system is imposing and powerful with military might. It's outwardly religious, scientific, cultured, and elegant, but seething with national and commercial rivalries and ambitions, is upheld in any real crisis only by armed force. That's a good definition of the world. Love not the world nor the things that are in the world. And to the extent that we tolerate the world, or that we seek to make compromise with the world, or to sort of say we can live with the world, we are accepting partial victory. Second one is coexistence with the enemy. Coexistence with the enemy. By bringing formal agreements with the enemy, they legitimize their existence. How do we accept partial victory and coexistence with the enemy. Boy, we could go on to that for hours, right? There's so many ways. I just want to give you one example. It's one that just came to mind because I've done enough with it, and that's evolution. Evolution. Well, you say, what do you mean? Is it the enemy? It is the mortal enemy of Christ. Evolution is the mortal enemy of Christ. G. Richard Bozarth, writing in The American Atheist. This is not a Christian writing. This is an atheist. And he says, Christianity has fought, still fights, and will fight science, by which he means evolutionary philosophy, to the desperate end over evolution, because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. If Jesus was not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. What all this means is that Christianity cannot lose the doctrine of geocentrism and get along. The battle must be waged, for Christianity is fighting for its very life. And we have seen in liberal Christian churches the acceptance of evolutionary theory and compromise with it in theistic evolution and all the other hybrids that we try to make, and try to make God the author of survival of the fittest. And it's deadly. Go back to that original slide on the history of the world. It began, and not that long ago. It was called into existence out of nothing by a purposeful creator, not by a purposeless chance interaction of matter and energy. It has everything to do with your life. And it makes all the difference when it comes to morals and ethics, when it comes to your happiness, when it comes to your hope for anything in the future, for any idea of security in life. Others I could think of would be the whole LGBTQ thing. The vast number of Christian churches, even evangelical churches, which really resisted a lot of the modernism of the last century, are now beginning to fall before the gay onslaught. We're beginning to see the acceptance of homosexuality. If you go ahead and take a survey of young people today in the evangelical church, the majority will say, well, the Bible is fine about homosexuality. It's okay to live a gay lifestyle and be a Christian. We need to be very careful about living coexistence with an enemy that is as dangerous as that. And then the union through marriage and religion, of course, 2 Corinthians 6, 14 to 15, I'm not going to have you read that, Jack, is be not unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what concord hath Christ with Belial? First question I think of when my child brings home a date. What's first question?
Is he a Christian?
Do they know Christ Jesus? Not, are they mouthing good words? Are they saying what I want to hear? I want to know, do they know my Savior? Because if you want to be in an intimate relationship with someone else, you must be in agreement on the most important questions of life. We should never take it lightly that our children or our grandchildren will marry into unbelieving families. If they do, we had better make sure they know what they're doing. We better make sure that we drive a stake in the ground and say, this is not what we think is good for you. This is not what we think God wants. But once they do, you have to accept that person and love them and all the things that we do in a family. But that means there's trouble ahead. There's storm clouds on the horizon. And always, marriage has an effect on religion. And I've taught adults now for 40 years. A lot of young marrieds too. And I will say I've observed that when a girl from an evangelical Christian family marries outside the faith, you won't see her for a while, and eventually she'll come back alone. And she'll leave the house that morning, stepping over her husband who's watching the football game from last night and mocking her for going to church and being such a fool. And she comes looking for solace and for comfort and for fellowship and for truth. But boys that marry outside of the faith, not so much. They don't come back. And that was God's problem for Israel. You intermarry with the Moabites, they will draw you off to worship their gods. And so that's a big deal. There are other ways of being unequally yoked. Think of business relationships. I'm sure there are a few here who could tell us of times when they got into a business partnership or something with an unbeliever and it did not turn out well. So that's the lessons of corruption. Then there's the matter of lawlessness. It says at the very end, it says, every man did what was right in his own eyes. Yeah, does that sound like today? Proverbs 14:12 tells us something about that. Go ahead and read that for me, Jack.
There's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end, it leads to death.
There's a way that seems right to a man. I'm gonna do what I feel. I mean, I remember when Robert DeHaan used to go to the streets of New York and he'd be the man on the street and ask questions about God and things like that. And the answer was always very interesting. I feel, well, you know, I feel that God's, that God's there. He's there, all right, yeah. But I feel that it doesn't have anything to do with me. I feel. We are told to look at the God within, right? This isn't something new. This goes back to the 1700s as far as thought, ideas in philosophy, and it now permeates the social imaginary. It is everywhere. We live in a day when a man can say, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, and everybody says, you are so courageous for saying that. Because we believe not only are we whatever we will to be, this goes back to Nietzsche, but our will can overcome even biology. And not only are we what we will to be, but you must approve and celebrate what I say I am. Now, a lot of cultural illustrations of that. Debbie Boone, Christian believer, daughter of Pat Boone. She sings, it can't be wrong if it feels so right. Now, there's a theological statement for you. Sammy Davis Jr., I gotta be me, right? I gotta be me. I gotta be authentic. Frank Sinatra, I did it my way, right? Sure. Oh, this is called expressive individualism, and it permeates our society. The authentic expression of my inner self trumps everything. That's not what God's law says. God's law says that we are broken, we are rebellion in sin, and we must learn to conform to his law, not to our inner being. The outside of us should determine what we are. We need to learn righteousness. We need to be redeemed so that we can be good. And good is set outside of us, not within us. Now, I was watching a portion of America's Got Talent with Carol Ann one night. And this woman comes on, she's a singer, and they ask her a question. What do you hope? Why do you think you want to be chosen as the winner of this thing? And I want you to hear what she has to say. Her name is Storm Large. Says it all. Okay, now just hopefully this will work.
Storm, please tell the judges why they should put you through.
Listen to the end.
Because I just want to bare my soul as much as I possibly can, be as authentic as I can, and show people that they can be their true selves unapologetically and be celebrated for that.
All right.
They can be their true selves unapologetically and celebrated for that. And what came after that? Glorious applause, right? You're so brave. You're so good to do that. We agree wholeheartedly. Watch the Olympics, and afterwards you can hear them say, you can be anything you want to be. It's shallow, but it is deeply convicting in the lives of the people that live around us. Romans chapter 1 tells us about that, and I don't have time to go into it, but you know Romans 1 pretty well. Beginning with rejecting God, then they go ahead and they worship the creation, and rather than the creator, and it talks about the depravity that it brings, and it goes downhill all the way to the end of the chapter to what one preacher who was preaching on the subject said, it goes to social insanity, and that is where we are. And of course, lawlessness leads to violence, right? Sure. And it's one of the great themes of the book of Judges. Violence is everywhere. I'm not going to read you Judges 9:5, but that's where Gideon's son takes and kills 70 of his brothers and launches a civil war that destroys an entire city. The blood and the gore is everywhere. Now, if you want to read the story and the description of a truly lawless nation that is dying, read Isaiah chapter 59. Now, I'll just have Jack read a portion of it for you. Isaiah 59, 6-7.
Their cobwebs are useless for clothing. They cannot cover themselves with what they make. Their deeds are evil deeds, and acts of violence are in their hands. Their feet rush into sin. They are swift to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are evil thoughts. Ruin and destruction mark their ways.
It says at the beginning of that chapter, your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you, and he will not hear. And then leading up to this verse about violence says, no one calls for justice. No one pleads a case with integrity. Does that sound familiar? They rely on empty arguments. They utter lies. They conceive trouble and give birth to evil. Later on, it talks about we grope against the wall like blind men. We look for justice, but justice is nowhere to be found. That's the description of a nation, of a people that is dying. Why? Because they have forgotten God. Alexander Solzhenitsyn used to say that. He said he got it from his grandmother, I think. She said, all these bad things that are happening in the run-up to the Soviet Revolution, she said, all these bad things that are happening for one reason. We have forgotten God, and that is the only reason. And the only solution is to return to him. The entire book is drenched in violence and war. And lastly is depravity. And we aren't going to spend a lot of time on that because I mentioned it early, but chapter 17 to 21 give us two stories that are designed to describe the results when men completely reject God and his law, and they are really, really bad. The theme, the path of degradation that the book of Judges shows us is not the only place God shows it to us. It begins at the very beginning when Adam and Eve sin, and then it results eventually in Cain killing his brother Abel, and then working all the way down to the wickedness of the world before the flood. It's in the nation of Israel during the period of the kings. You see that same thing. Nations follow a path of degradation unless they are continually re-energized by faith in God. Now for Israel, as the period of the judges comes to end in 1 Samuel, Eli's the judge. He's 90 years old. The Philistines have attacked, and they go out to war, and they have an enormous defeat. And what the people do is they say, let's get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it out here with us. And we'll parade it up and down, kind of like we did around Jericho. Remember that? They saw the Ark as kind of a good luck charm, as a talisman. And so they brought it out as the sign that God was with them, but God wasn't with them. They had a terrible defeat. Eli's two sons were killed. Eli himself falls over and dies, is killed. And then Eli's daughter-in-law, her husband, her father-in-law, both just suddenly died. The nation has been completely defeated, and the Ark of God is gone. And she goes into labor, and she gives birth to a child. And it's verse 21, Jack. She names him Ichabod.
She named the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel because of the capture of the Ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband.
The glory is departed from Israel, for the Ark of God has been taken. God is not with us anymore. What a difference from the glory of the fall of Jericho and the conquest under Joshua, the crossing of the Red Sea and all those wonderful things, down to this point where they're all defeated, where they're fighting amongst one another. They're morally, utterly corrupt. And now the Ark of God has been taken, and symbolically, God is not with them anymore. So she names the child Ichabod. Each time their rejection of the Lord and they go to worship the Baals, it results in ever-increasing depravity and death. then in their pain, the people cry out to God for deliverance, even though they were undeserving, and God knew they would fall right back into idolatry as soon as their pain was relieved. In spite of that, God shows them compassion, and he delivers them through leaders that give them some peace. They weren't all good men. Some of them were rough and tough. Some of them went astray. But God used them anyway to preserve his people. I was thinking about what's been happening over the last couple of weeks in Afghanistan. You know, we've abandoned our own people. We've abandoned those who are our allies. We have left in ignominious defeat, being defeated by a medieval, wicked group of people. We certainly have gone to the point where Ichabod would apply to us. And I could think only of 1938, when Neville Chamberlain, as you recall, Prime Minister of England, went over to Munich and he negotiated with Hitler in order to preserve the peace. And in so doing, without their consent, he gave up Czechoslovakia to be occupied and oppressed by the Germans. It was as dishonorable a thing as anybody had ever done in appeasing an enemy. And he comes back and gets out of the plane, he waves the paper, he says, "I have made peace in our time. Go home and get a good night's sleep." Winston Churchill had something to say about that. Besides saying that you have sought to avoid war, you have only gotten dishonor, and you will still have war. And then he says this: "This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year upon year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor, we arise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time." I have this overwhelming feeling, it just seems to me, that we could use a judge in our time. May not be a very good man, maybe rough, maybe godly, we don't know. But oh, that God would raise up a deliverer that would first of all point us back to the God of our fathers and deliver us from evil. Pray that he raises one up, or maybe more than one soon.